Teeth here from pickinglessons.com. Bluegrass Licks on the mandolin. This is the second volume of licks we're going to have a look at. The first lesson focused more on open G position and looking the 1, 4, 5 chords in that open position. This video is all about movable shapes. This example was in B. We didn't use any open strings in that example at all. So the licks we're going to be checking out really do transfer themselves to any other key we wish on the mandolin. We're focusing on 2 scale positions and a couple of double stops that are really accessible within those 2 scale shapes. And we'll be moving around the 1, 4, 5 chords, but these licks are all movable, so it doesn't matter which chord you're on. You can kind of play them over any of the chords, and like I said, in any key. In a moment, we're going to take a look at the couple of scale shapes to set us up and the 2 double stops, and we'll have a look at a couple of short lick ideas as well to get us going. But if you head to pickinglessons.com, you can grab the chart that we're working through. So the complete chart has all our scales and double stops. We've got 10 lick examples, some shorter ones and slightly longer ones, and then that example that I just demonstrated at the beginning where we can put them all together into somewhat of a pretty typical bluegrass progression. So pickinglessons.com. Now, let's have a look at these scale positions. You may be somewhat familiar with these, but we're going to just touch over them anyway. These are all movable shapes, and we are going to be working out of B. So our B root note that we're sort of focusing on to begin with is that 2nd fret on string 2, on the A string. So there's our B. And this scale shape, so there's our root note, and this is the scale position. This is a major blues scale. So that little box there. So that flat 3 is outside the major scale, that's the blue note. So that's our box. Now the root note is the B note there, so it's sort of in the middle of the pattern, but sometimes what I will do is really just focus on that B, maybe move up, and then move down. So a good exercise just to kind of ground yourself with that B, in this case the root note there, is to perhaps move up. We can come back down the scale and then finish on the B. So B is our grounding point. Yeah, it's the root note of the position we are in. So that's our number 1 position. 2nd position, again, starts on that B, and this time we're only going to ascend through the scale notes. And we finish up on that high B. So it's 1 complete octave of the scale pattern. The first one wasn't a complete octave, yeah? So this one is a complete octave. And again, we have that flat 3 in there, so there's our first note. We can count these scale degrees. So that's our 1, our major 2nd, our flat 3, that's the blue note, major 3rd, there's our 5th, there's our 6th note of the major scale, and there's our root note again on top. We can combine the 2 together, so 1 big long scale. Yeah, something like that. But splitting them off into 2 little boxes is kind of handy, because then you can think about, right, I've got this position here, but then you can think, okay, with this double stop, which we'll get to in a moment, we've got a different position. Just before we move on though, there's an additional note we can add in as we move up higher, which is really accessible. That's the flat 7. So the flat 7 is outside the scale as well, but it's one of those blue notes. There's our flat 3, 6, flat 7 to the root note. So the flat 7 serves this style of music very well, and we can certainly use it in our playing as well. Yeah, so there is that one. So there are 3 kind of scale shapes that we're calling on as we move through. Now they can be moved to any position, and we're also using them over the other chord changes in this example. So when we go to the 4 chord, the E, yeah, same deal. If I went to the F sharp, I could do the same thing. If I wanted to change key, same approach. Just find the root note. There's a D. I could play this in D. And so on. We're not using any open strings, so we're really focusing on those closed position notes with these patterns. So get yourself a pretty good understanding of those scale shapes and understand where that root note is. You'll notice I've put it in brackets there in the chart just to sort of highlight that that's the root note. Now, inside these scale shapes, we have 2 really accessible double stops, so without having to change position as such. So if we look at this first double stop here, This one is using that root note, the B, and its fifth below. So it's the 1 and the 5 from the major chord, remembering that a major chord uses the first, third, and fifth scale notes to build to the major shape. Now, we're using just 2 of those notes for this double stop, so the root note and the fifth, and notice it's inside this first of the scale shapes. Yeah, so it's really accessible, it's right there, we don't have to shift anywhere. We'll look at this example in a moment, but this lick is really common. Yeah, it's a cool little kick. So that double stop is right there in the scale. We'll get to that one. The next double stop is as we move up into the next pattern. Okay, so that's still the B double stop. This time there is no B note in there. So we're using the third of the chord, which is the D sharp, and we're using the fifth of the chord, which is the F sharp. So the 3 and 5, so no B in there, but we're assuming it's the B, yeah? That's how we're using it. And so that is surrounded by, yeah, that sort of higher second pattern that we've played. So those 2 double stops are there in those positions. So we're having, while I'm playing over a B chord, I don't have to shift my hand to access any of that. There are other options we can shift, there are other double stops, but for this lesson, we're just focusing on this one position, and then we'll change that position for the other chords. So to give you an example of how we can use some of these double stops and scale notes in combination to form some ideas for licks, let's have a look at the first 4 licks here. And what we have for this first one is the example I mentioned just earlier, which you often hear as a kick, but it's great for any point in the lick, just running up through to the root note of the B in this case. So all these licks are B licks. As I mentioned, they're all movables. They could be appropriate for any chord if we just shifted it to the right position. But for B, yeah. So we have that double stop. So that's the root note and the fifth. That kicks us off. And then we run through what we have in that pentatonic scale there, that next note, the box, to the root note. So 3 scale notes, but with the double stop included. So that's a good one. So you could go off and do anything after that. So we're over the B chord. Whatever, yeah? So you get the idea. So it's a great little start, but it can also be put in amongst others. The next lick idea is just a double stop, but it's how we use that double stop. So for example, it's this second one that we learned. So that's the major third and the perfect fifth. And we're going to play a tremolo on top of this, but then accent 2 quarters. So here's the idea. Yeah, so that's a great way of featuring that double stop. Very mandolin sounding. And so when we play the double stop, get that flurry of notes, we're just going to end up playing in time. So if it's a slow tempo, you'll probably fit more notes in. If it's a faster tempo, you're not going to play as many notes, but it's that quick flurry of notes. So if we're playing a slow tempo, yeah, if it's a faster tempo, still kind of getting the same idea, but the tremolo there, and then 2 quarter notes on the end as an accent. You may have noticed that in the example. I used that a couple of times at that example in the beginning of the video on different chords. The third lick along, all right, so this one here, we're using this flat 3, so very bluesy sound, because we have a root note, our major second, there's our flat 3. So here's the lick. Nice short little idea, yeah? An example, if we use the first and then the third licks along side by side, yeah, we can start pulling them together. So that would be while the B chord is being played. And then we can carry on doing other things after that. The fourth idea, so this is the last one we'll finish up with here at the moment, but this fourth idea, we're going to run further along the scale, not resolving to the root note because we don't have to. What we are looking for though are the arpeggio notes. So if you're unsure of what the arpeggio notes are for a particular chord, we've got plenty of lessons at pickinlessons.com on arpeggio, so you can check that out. But just very briefly, again, the major chord, B major, has the first, third and fifth scale notes. So we're looking for one of those notes, yeah, from the chord, which is what I just sort of highlighted there. And so by finishing on the F sharp, we're still finishing inside the chord with this lick. Yeah, it's just a straight scale run. but finishing on that F sharp brings us sort of inside the B chord. We could do something like this. Yeah, first lick into fourth. That was second into fourth. Why don't I just play one after the next and we'll see how that goes. Yeah, that's kind of cool. So bearing in mind that would be while the B chord's being played the whole time. We could chop and change those as we see fit. We could blur where their starting position is. We don't have to start them on beat 1. Perhaps we started on beat 2, and so that will change how that lick sort of sits and how it moves into either a continuation of the same chord or perhaps the next chord moving along. So one of the things we're going to look at in the next part of this lesson is moving between the chords. So looking at the ideas where we might go from B into the E, so the 1 to the 4, or perhaps the B to the F sharp, so the 1 to the 5, or vice versa, F sharp back to B. And so we'll look at how we can connect these ideas as well. Bearing in mind, there's not one way of doing this. There are loads of ways. The whole point though is that we're highlight against our chords. So back to the idea of using the arpeggio. So the double stop gives you some insight into the chord notes. Knowing a particular chord, how to play it, gives you an insight into which notes belong to the chord. We can visually see that there, but then also having a really strong knowledge of the arpeggios. So if it's something you're not familiar with or not too sure of, I would suggest sort of checking out a lesson on arpeggios. So pickinglessons.com, you can have a search there and there are plenty of them for the mandolin. But to continue this lesson, do head over to pickinglessons.com. You can grab yourself a copy of the worksheet. Yeah, so the rest of these licks we're about to learn, and we'll break down that example solo as well. So pickinglessons.com. I'll see you there.